So thank you first, all of you, for agreeing to take part in this panel discussion. I would like to begin by turning to Dr. Almén, Oskar Almén, to give us a short background.
Just got to make sure that it's working. Is it working? No.
Well, we will soon find out. But the significance of this party congress, and give us a background to it.
Now it's working, right?
Yeah, it is. So, Oskar.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel, and I see it as a great chance to talk about my views on Chinese politics, which I love to talk about. So, just a short introduction then to why the Congress. First of all, I think we should make a clear distinction between the party, the Communist Party, and the state in China. So this is solely a party thing. The state's meeting, the equivalent of that, will be held later in the next year in March, where they elect the president and other state structures. So this is something that is commonly confused when we talk about Chinese politics. So essentially, in the Swedish context, that would be the Social Democratic Party having a congress every 5 years. Of course, it's completely different in the case of China. So what's happening is that you have 2,300 delegates meeting together once every 5 years, and these 2,300 delegates then elect formally the Central Committee. Now, of course, in practice, this means that these nominees to the Central Committee has already been selected previously, so the influence from below is strictly limited. Then further on, the Central Committee formally then elects the Politburo and the Standing Committee, which is the central power of the Chinese Communist Party. And I also saw on the news regarding this Congress that there has been a change when it comes to the election process, where previously in the last two Congresses there have been an ingredients of inner party democracy. There has been some kind of selection process, but this apparently has been reduced for this Congress. We are not sure exactly in what way this the influence of the election was reduced, because Xinhua didn't really reveal the details of that. But that's one aspect of a change of the recent Congress. Now, this Congress is also important, you can say, for the last 20-25 years. There have been forms of this Congress that have been institutionalized in a very important way, that essentially form a kind of rule-based decision-making process in China, which is really important. We're going to come back to that problem, how important it is for a system like China to have institutionalized rules to making decisions and to appointing political leaders. And this is why there's been a lot of talk about to what extent these informal norms and rules of the party will be followed by Xi Jinping and others. And this is something that we will then come back to.
Thank you very much. Anyone from the panel wants to compliment what we heard from Oskar here?
I think Mr. Oskar knows a lot about the Congress. First of all, that's difficult, especially for a foreign friend. But I'm afraid I have to point out that there are some mistakes, maybe. First of all, it's about the election of the Central Committee members. It's not pre-decided. This is an election process. The delegates vote their ballots, and of course there are a recommendation list, but the list is much more, the number is much bigger than the people got elected. So, and there are some people maybe not in the list can be elected to the committee. So the committee the Congress delegates have a full democratic rights to vote for their own candidate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question for the panel would be: what are the key outcomes, in your view, of the Congress? Kristina, would you like to start off?
I think that one of the key outcomes is that we still do not know who will come after Xi Jinping. We also have seen that Xi Jinping, I think it was quite a successful party congress. He manifested his power, you can say, and he didn't overdo it. He still allowed other factions to have their members. So that's one of the things. I mean, we could go on. Maybe somebody else want to continue?
Lora, perhaps.
Certainly. I mean, my background being more from the military side, of the security side, perhaps I can focus on a few of those takeaways. Certainly from that standpoint, I think there's a great deal of continuity for some of the developments that China was already engaging in. Certainly within the discussion, as we heard from the comments earlier from the ambassador, the focus is still on development, peaceful rise, and peaceful integration into the larger community. And yet at the same time, a big component of this, of course, is being able to protect sea lines of communication, economic interests abroad, civilians abroad. And so as part of that, we really can't leave out the military role in all of this. And it's not just about the tactical side. I think from a strategic perspective as well, if you look at the speech from Xi Jinping, he mentioned great power, strong power 26 times, which was actually an increase from previous leaders within China. He advocated a modern army, navy, air force, rocket force, and strategic support force. So within all of this, I would really emphasize 3 areas that I think points to continuity. The first of these has to do with the organization of the military and how that plays into this larger development goal. The second is technology, and the third is projection. In terms of organization, China has sought to build up coordination and joint operations, certainly through its theater commands, which they've actually reduced in number from 7 to 5 over the past few years. If you saw within the Party Congress the new list of the Central Military Commission members, they've also shrunken or decreased from 11 to 7. Now this marks a larger streamlining that I think is occurring throughout all levels of government, but particularly within the military as well. And certainly within this, there is this concept of ideological indoctrination and regulation. The Department of Discipline Inspection has been elevated above the Equipment and Logistics Department. We see individuals like General Wei Fenghe, who has served as the commander of PLA's rocket force, being looked at potentially as the new Minister of Defense. That still remains to be seen. And so that's where you have some continuity. Where it's starting to lack continuity is perhaps that within this shakeup, we have seen a number of generals within the anti-corruption drive start to be taken down. We've seen General Xu Caihou, who was the former vice chairman of the CMC, and others who are under investigation, like General Fang Fenghui. Also, 4 service heads and the commanders of 3 of 5 of the military theater commands have been replaced. We've seen 9 of 15 departments as well have changes. So there is some shakeup going on within, certainly, the leadership within the military. But all of this points to a consolidation, streamlining under the party. In terms of technology, from 2015, China established the Strategic Support Force to oversee military operations in space, cyber, electromagnetic, and information domains. And this was pointed as an area of development, certainly by the ambassador, for developing not just the military, but also the economic growth of the country at large. Younger military leaders with greater familiarity with technology and modern military thought are being promoted through the ranks. And in fact, according to some estimates, an estimated 87% of the military delegates to the Party Congress were first-timers. So in other words, they had not been to previous Party Congresses. And Chairman Xi Jinping pointed to this in pointing to the idea of strength in technology, quality, aerospace, cyberspace, and transportation, and creating a digital China. So I think these are some of the trends that we will see in the future that once again flows into the economic development of the country, R&D, joint technological development. Finally, I mentioned projection. Feeding into these development aims, the PLA Navy is to expand its presence abroad to protect military supply ports, channels, and civilian personnel stationed abroad. This has already been marked by the establishment of China's first overseas military base in Djibouti and expansion of its peacekeeping forces to 8,000. And as we heard earlier, I think that there is, and I'm saying this in part as an American, I think there is this implicit reference being made to the United States when we talk about hegemony, not interfering in the activities or the internal affairs of other countries. And I'd like to highlight in Chairman Xi Jinping's quote, "China's development does not pose a threat to any other country. No matter what stage of development it reaches, China will never seek hegemony or engage in expansion." That being said, he also stated that a military is built to fight. All military works must adhere to the standards of being able to fight a war and to win a war. This actually points to the question that came from our audience earlier. So this shows that the emphasis is, of course, on sea lines of communication, commerce abroad, and some of these points that have been made earlier, but it's also to ensure domestic integrity and territorial sovereignty, and that will impinge upon other issues that will no doubt be a subject of today, which is South China Sea, Taiwan, among others.
Okay. Kristina, you wanted to say to comment something?
No, but I feel like maybe I should say something about the economic, because that's what I'm looking more at.
Yes.
So one of the things that was highlighted during this party congress was also to continue with the economic reforms, and we will most likely see more of the economic reforms in the third plenum that comes up within a year. And to me, I see that China continues on its way going forward. They say that we're going to liberalize the economy, but there are many things that are not happening. And but because they still say that we will focus on state-owned enterprises, will still remain in charge of vital areas, for example, energy parts and so on. And Xi Jinping also said in his speech that that they want to open up China for more foreign direct investments. But I think that many foreign companies are now a little bit wary because China has been going out so much, investing abroad, and China is not. We are giving China a lot of market access, but China is not giving as much market access to foreign companies as we are doing in the West. So that is a problem. So I see when he speaks about all these things, as the ambassador also mentioned, to fight against poverty and to alleviate income gaps and so on, and to develop the country because there are still many parts which are really poor. I think that that is really, I mean, it's not something that is new for Xi Jinping or any Chinese communist leader to say. But also we have to look beyond the words. What is really happening? Because there is one thing saying that we should close down the steel mills that are generating overcapacity, but does Xi Jinping really have the power to close them down? He hasn't managed to close down so many steel mills during the last 5 years, and it's quite hard job because there is local resistance and so on. So those are some of my...
Well, the conclusion is, of course, there's a lot of work ahead, and we have to follow these developments very, very closely to see what is behind the words and what actually will take place. Yes. Oskar, you want to comment on?
Yeah, just shortly then. I think as a takeaway point, the last 5 years that has been going on under Xi Jinping, I've been increasingly worried about the concentration of political power and the centralization of power, which I think, not from a typically Western, democratic point of view, but because I think it's bad for stability in China, and I think to concentrate too much power in the hand of one person isn't good for China or for the Communist Party either. So I had pretty negative expectations of this Congress in terms of what was going to happen, what was going to happen, and to what extent Xi Jinping would follow these norms that I was talking about before. And I must say that I'm a bit positively surprised that they turn out to not be as norm-breaking as I was fearing. Well, he did break some of those rules and norms, but he also did follow some. And I think that the setup of the Standing Committee of the Politburo seems quite interesting, actually. So I have a less negative view now than I had before the Congress, I would say.
Mr. Lee, would you like to comment what your colleagues, the panel colleagues, referring to the military, to the trade? I have to. I suppose so too. I think we're eagerly waiting for your comments.
First of all, just now Ambassador Gui has made a quite good introduction. All the main messages there. I can add some my personal observations. For me, I think the most important message from this Congress is the Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. What does this mean? This means now China, after a long period of efforts, we have entered into a new era. That is, we are closer to the realization of our 2 centenary goals. First goal is to become to build a prosperous, moderately prosperous society in all aspects. And the second goal is to basically realize the modernization. From now on till the next Party Congress, this is the time frame for the realization of the goals. We are very confident that at that time the goal will be achieved. To achieve this new goal, this centenary goals, we need a new posture, new style, and more efforts. For example, people, Madam sit behind me, next to me, talked about the defense policy. In the next 5 years, I'm sure the Chinese military will grow even stronger and more ready to fight. And but our defense policy is the same. That is defensive policy. Military is always the last resort to solve the problem. And unless China's security, territorial integrity is seriously under threat, after all diplomatic, political means, we reserve the right to fight for our country, to fight for our people. For example, if some people tries to separate Taiwan from China as the last resort, well, God forbid, military means will be used. But I'm very confident that the cross-strait relations will maintain the peace and development direction. So I'm not sure whether I answered your question. Just like the ambassador said about the interference of land interference of internal affairs. As for the rule-based governance or the law-based governance, this principle is applied both to the party and to the government. No one is above the law. We all should follow the rules. I'm sure the re-election of President Xi Jinping as Central Secretary is the consensus of the party delegates and reflects the consensus of the Chinese people. And all other members of the standing committee are also elected by the people. If you follow the news after the election, Chinese people wholeheartedly supported them. As for who will be the next leader, and well, that is $1 billion question. If you can get it in right now, then you will get rich very soon. You will find the new leader, but I'm afraid it's not possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. When in the keynote speech, the ambassador referred to what the president said repeatedly, the new era. And what is the panel's view of the meaning of this, and what implications will it have for China's future development? If you try to be brief and concise. And also linked to this is, of course, how should the entering of the president's thought of socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era be interpreted? So this goes to the whole panel. Who would like to start? Yeah, Lora?
I guess I'll start. And obviously I defer to our other panelists, especially our political experts, to clarify further. But when I heard this term, obviously, of a new era, it, for me, harkens back to, from a historical standpoint, this continuity that we spoke about earlier in moving from Mao Zedong really represented this first era. Then you had under Deng Xiaoping these massive, emblematic, epoch type of developments. And so Xi Jinping is kind of developing into the third era, so to speak. It is a new era, but it does provide a certain historical legitimacy all along the way. In terms of the contents of what that new era is meant to contain, certainly from the time that he's come into power, to office, we have seen this concept of a China dream, this idea of development, of providing essentially the platform, the foundation for people to rise up out of poverty throughout the entire country. And so I would say that's probably one of the major hallmarks for not just his time in office, but something that he wishes to carry into the future. And the hallmark of all of this is certainly going to be the Belt and Road Initiative. That's essentially something he's looking to carry out through multiple generations in the future, not just his own.
Now, the Belt and Road Initiative was mentioned. Maybe someone could explain it to the audience in 5 sentences. Kristina, what are you?
The
Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes. Okay, the Belt and Road Initiative is basically the name of the super big infrastructure investments that China wants to do in its neighboring countries and all the way to Europe, Africa, but I think they also have like wonderful pictures of going all the way around the world, basically. And everything, I personally see it as a trademark. So if you can put any project under the Belt and Road Initiative, then you can push it through the bureaucracy really quickly. But it's a political and it is an economic and also foreign policy project. And I strongly believe that Xi Jinping did not wake up one morning and say, oh, I'm going to do the Belt and Road Initiative, because this has been going on for a long, long time, even before he came into power.
Thank you. Coming back to the new era issue, which we started off with. Oskar?
Mm-hmm. Well, the new era, I'd rather comment on the socialism and Chinese characteristics. I mean, this is of course not a new concept in China, it's been used for a long time. And I would say that naming is a part of, the important part here is for Xi Jinping to have his ideas enshrined in the constitution. The meaning of it, I think at this stage is difficult to know, because this is a process that all Chinese leaders are doing. They name the theory or the ideas of their era. And usually it takes a long time before we actually realize what's in this. So, for example, the 3 representatives of Jiangxi, I mean, nobody knew what that was when it was launched. It just sounded really strange. But it turned out to be some kind of legitimation of a change of the Communist Party representing, you know, the elite more, and not only be a traditional revolutionary party. And that was a very important change that China was making, and the Communist Party, and to introduce private entrepreneurs into the party, for example. So that, but we didn't know that at the time when that idea was presented. I think it's the same with this. Of course we can speculate what it means, but it's basically a way to legitimize the policy that Xi Jinping is pursuing.
Do you agree with that,
Yes,
Kristina?
I agree. I'm also thinking of the new era of China being a bigger global player that the West has to learn how to handle. Because Xi Jinping also talked in his speech about how China would be a role model for other developing countries, how to create economic growth without having to go down this horrible way of becoming a democratic country. and abiding to. I mean, many Western countries are asking that we give foreign aid to them, but we do it on certain conditions. Whereas China is not going that way. They are only in it for the business. They are in it for the development per se, not to create to project liberal views as we do in Sweden, for example. And I think that this is something that we should all think about really a lot, because this is kind of worrying, because we are used to live in a world where the liberal democratic values are the ones that we are putting forward, whereas China does not have, even if Xi Jinping is talking about democratic values and human rights and so on, he does not have the same connotation as we have in the West. He talks of it, it's the same words, but it's different, it's something else behind the words. And I think this is something that could actually alter the world, the global order, eventually, because if we're talking about that China will work in the UN, for example, and they're proposing working democratically in the UN. Well, we have one vote, one country, but what if the majority of the countries are dictatorships and not pro-democratic values? Then that could be kind of an interesting future for us, so to say.
Well, that question itself would merit a separate panel.
Yes.
Definitely. Mr. Lee, would you like to comment briefly on what the other panelists, your colleague panelists, have said?
Maybe we can understand the new era in another way. Just like a long march, we are crossing many mountains, and we have our different goals. Now the new era is that as for the two secondary goals, now it's within reach. With our, in the past, we have the goal, but goal seems far away. But from now on, it's just within reach. Just like in the last stride, then you can reach the goal. So in this special period, that's the dawn of the realization of the centenary goals. This is the new period, the new era. But some people say the dawn of a day is the darkest time. And in other means, maybe the last stop is most difficult. And we have to concentrate and work more harder. And we need a powerful central government, and we need the party to unite and lead the people to fight more harder. This is the new era. As for I agree with her. Of course, when we speak about democracy, human rights, we have different connotations. For example, we think the human rights not only includes political, social rights, but also economic rights. And for us, we think that especially for the developing people, for them, the most urgent need is the improvement of their living standard. Some people even do not have enough to eat, do not have enough clothes to wear. So that's why when we have development cooperations with other developing countries to realize the 2030 goal, we focus more on the local people's real needs. As for what kind of democratic model they will take, that is their choice. That is their internal affairs. We do not interfere.
But surely it would help if you have the same interpretation or close to one another what the concept entails. Is that too much to ask?
I agree with that. The main question is that it seems to me, usually the strong wants to impose their will on others. I think this is not a democratic behavior. We should reach a consensus.
Which maybe can be reached by exchanges and discussions and development of common understanding of the concept. Oskar, would you like to add something to this on what we discussed at the moment?
You mean the concepts
Yeah.
and those kind of... Yeah, well, I think it's a very interesting question. I think the word democracy, for example, is too broad to be used in this, because it's being used to define so many different things. And I think maybe we could be more specific when we're talking about work. So what the Chinese criticize is the liberal democratic model, and then they say we have another kind of democracy in China. But I mean, from a Western perspective, that is kind of strange, because what it means essentially is that the Communist Party embodies the will of the people, and that is in essence democracy. But these are completely different things. So I think, I think actually what should be good is to define the Chinese governance model in a clearer way, not using these Western words that are being used. So instead of saying, well, we are striving to build democracy, because China is not striving to build democracy in the way that the Western world thinks of it generally, but they are building a governance model that might have a different kind of legitimacy, that might be working in a different way. So why use the word democracy? That's what I'm asking. And I think that China was going in a very interesting direction for a while. They were building a system with very limited, but some political participation, a kind of consultative, I think that was the word used by the ambassador, consultative democracy, where you use inputs from society to a large extent and to develop a kind of legitimate government, but not democracy in the liberal sense. But that's what I've been worrying about, that this model, this collective model, this consultative model has been more and more limited these 5 years under Xi Jinping. So, which is, I think, then is a danger for the Communist Party and for China to. That's what I'm not saying that China should become anyway in the West, the way that West is developing. But I don't see the sustainability of the model that is being built now, where there is less listening to the voices of the people, less room for civil society to act, more and more censorship from an already really limited model. So, yeah.
Let me say a few words about democracy.
A few words.
A few words. Democracy does not mean only ballots. If you say multi-party system and elections, voting, people going to the vote to vote, if this process means democracy, then in many developing countries they have this process. And when they adopt this process, they do not achieve better development. Usually, at the end of the election process, there will be problems. The loser will not go. The winner insists to get the power. As a result, there will be internal fights, civil wars. I'm not sure. We don't say Chinese model is the best, but the Chinese consultative democracy serves Chinese people better, and we are more confident to make more contribute Chinese wisdom to the good governance of our country, which is the better way.
Okay, thank you very much for that. But just as a moderator, one objection. I don't think that throwing the ballot and that the winner goes to government leads to internal fights all the time in Western democracies. I think it was a bit...
Sometimes.
Yeah, it happens, but rarely, I would say. Leave that aside. Let's change subject now a bit. There were elections recently in Japan, and North Korea was a major topic during these elections. how did the crisis in the Korean Peninsula appear in the party congress? Was it at all present? How is North Korea talked about in China?
Sure, I think it's an excellent question, and one I'll start off by taking on. When we get to the 19th Party Congress, it was not a topic within certainly Xi Jinping's speech, and then I think also within the larger discourse. Although it being such a heady topic of today, it's probably more between the lines, once again. But I think, and this is an area that I've been researching for about 20 years now, actually, when I was based in China as well, looking at how Chinese experts, officials, military, technical community are talking about the North Korean issue. And I defer, of course, to our panelists from China if I'm incorrect. But what is striking is that there seems to be a large disconnect between the official statements on denuclearization, of course, in support of denuclearization that you see coming out from within China and its leadership, and the discussion on the ground. And there is a logic or a recognition of the logic that underpins China's nuclear program, I think is very apparent. And this idea of pursuing nuclear weapons, that China actually, in terms of its own nuclear forces, actually went through its own period, right, where it was responding to nuclear coercion from Western powers, and particularly the United States, in the 1950s and 60s, and saw the necessity of having nuclear weapons to defend the country against these potential external incursions, and also to gain international recognition and respect. There's still a recognition of that, and I certainly hear that a good deal in China and among my Chinese colleagues. And we also saw, even within the Chinese context, they conducted their nuclear tests just before the final signing of the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And certainly when we look at what North Korea has been engaged in, it's not surprising that they saw this. They see themselves in a similar position where they need to accelerate their capabilities on the ground in terms of missile tests, nuclear tests, before the window closes, so to speak, whatever that window may be. So I think that when we have had discussions, and a number of my colleagues have within China roundtables, the majority of Chinese political, academic, and industry experts continue to emphasize that North Korea's nuclear weapons are here to stay. They don't anticipate that the country wants to denuclearize or even necessarily freeze. They get the fact that North Korea does not want to become the next case of Libya, Iraq, Ukraine, right, in terms of giving up its nuclear capabilities at whatever level they are, and then potentially having its internal political system overturned, as we saw in those cases. And I think there is a calculation that we often miss, perhaps in terms of Chinese interests. It's not necessarily in its interest for North Korea to achieve complete denuclearization. I make this argument, I realize it's kind of provocative, but there is an argument in terms of stability. If it leads to the direction of Libya and these other cases I mentioned, that's not in China's interest. Stability is ultimately in China's interest. So in that regard, I think that there's also the sense that, of course, this is all focused on the United States. They have just as much of a focus on the US presence in the region, which they're trying to limit. And moreover, on the point of sanctions, which is probably the last point, I think that there is this general read, which is similar to what you hear coming out of North Korea, that sanctions have not worked, are not likely to work in the future. And that's why China itself has been looking for other options. Those options being the freeze for freeze proposal, of course, that's currently on the ground. But in terms of the long term, what we're seeing with denuclearization, I don't entirely buy into the fact that that is in China's interests and that that's something that it really even has thought through what that would look like in the future.
Do you agree with that?
Me? I think that was a perfect analysis, yes.
Okay.
I have a different opinion.
I'm sure you have, yeah. But I leave you to the last. Kristina, do you have anything to add to Lora's analysis of the...
No, I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
I agree that...
So, 3 against 1. Now, Mr. Lee.
China is a newcomer. So...
Newcomer in what game?
I mean, in this game.
Okay.
The Secretary General Xi Jinping's report to the Congress is 30,000 Chinese characters long. It takes him 3.5 hours to deliver. So the report only concentrates on strategic uncertainty or pressing issues. The Korean Peninsula nuclear problem is pressing, is complex, but Chinese policy is clear and consistent. We are firmly opposed to the nuclearization of the peninsula. We strongly oppose the North Koreans to develop nuclear weapons against it's a violation of the security resolutions. We really mean it. I'll give you one example. I learned from the Ambassador Gui when he met the State Secretary Dagri to the Prime Minister. I get the information. The North Korean's nuclear test sites are only 70 kilometers to the Chinese border. If anything happens, it will be an ecological, natural disaster. We don't want that. No one wants that. And but at the same time, we should think it over. Why the North Koreans would rather eat grass than give up their nuclear arsenal? Maybe because of the security situation. Maybe because of the threat, the grave security threat they are facing. Just now, our friend said, why in the 50s and 60s, why China developed nuclear weapons? Because we are under nuclear threats, blackmails from other nuclear powers. We want to safeguard our independence. We want to safeguard our territorial integrity. We have to have this nuclear weapon. So, how to solve this North Korean nuclear issue? It's China has made a proposal of 2 suspensions. That is, the North Koreans should suspend their nuclear programs, and at the same time, our American friends and South Korean friends should suspend their massive, aggressive military drills. And we should, when we, for example, I have a recommendation for other nuclear powers. Why not follow China's suit to publicly announce that we will not use nuclear weapons to others? We will not be the first use of nuclear weapons. So we solve their non-nuclear weapon countries' legitimate concern. Maybe this will be a good start.
Yeah, I thought you would merit a comment from Lora.
Yeah, I agree. I actually think we're not in discord here, because I think that the threat concept and this idea of nuclear blackmail or coercion motivated China, and you obviously, through your comments just now, demonstrated that understanding of the North Korean rationale, which I think is there. And it's important to recognize, when we talk about the position of these nuclear tests close to the Chinese border, this is certainly of concern, right? Radioactive concerns that, in fact, the test sites may leak across the border into China. But in fact, there was just recently a report about Chinese scientists talking to North Korean counterparts about this at the technical level and saying that they should move their test sites to another part of North Korea. Now, my point in this is that China's not saying don't test. The Chinese scientists are saying move your tests to another part of North Korea so they do not negatively impact us. So I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, I still don't see that that is necessarily shutting down this process. The other point is, and I completely, I feel for you with this idea of no first use. This is something that China has been working with the United States, trying to get the U.S. to sign on for many years now. In the U.S., because of extended deterrence, its connections with Japan and South Korea. That's been the excuse all along. But China has also not signed on to the nuclear ban on nuclear weapons, which I think that if China were really in support of denuclearization globally, it should sign on to. But those are my small modifications, perhaps. But I think that it still doesn't necessarily contradict what I mentioned earlier, this whole concept that reductions of U.S. military exercises in China's vicinity and the necessity of deployment of THAAD, we haven't talked about missile defense in South Korea, freezes on things like this are also in China's interests. So I mean, it can serve both countries' interests, and I think it's important to recognize the similar interests there. Thank you.
Okay, with that I think we leave the security issues for the time being, because that again would merit another talk, roundtable discussion. Coming back to trade, Kristina, what would a small country like Sweden benefit from what was said during the Congress on trade issues? What is the improved relations between China and Sweden when it comes to trade? What do you see ahead of us?
Coming from after this
Yes.
party congress, I think that both Sweden and China are very pro-free trade. But I think that we should, I mean, it is one thing when Xi Jinping stands there at the party congress or at the World Economic Forum and talks about how he's in favor of free trade and liberalization and so on. It's up to show if you really want to do it. I mean, it's one thing to say, and it's just lip service, and we have not seen. I mean, we have a lot of problems for foreign companies going into China. They do not have the same market Sweden has. We give Chinese companies a lot of market access here. I'm not sure that, I mean, China would have allowed a company like Huawei to set up their business next to if they had an Ericsson, like we did, for example. Because there are a lot of things that you need to consider. Everything that China is doing is not always what you have to look behind the curtain, so to say. And I do believe that if Xi Jinping is now talking about having greater market liberalization, more free trade, more open up for foreign direct investment, because China does need foreign direct investment, well, maybe we should actually take him to his word and say, okay, so you want more foreign direct investments, then take away all these things that are denying market access. Show us that you actually mean what you're saying.
So this is an issue where time will tell, I suppose.
Time will tell, but I think that we should also use this opportunity that he's actually saying these things and actually say, okay, so you say that you're going to close down the steel mills and stop dumping steel, cheap steel, Chinese steel on the world market. Do it. Show that you can actually do it. We need to see action. We do not need any more beautiful speeches. We need to see something happening as well.
Mr. Lee, I won't ask you to comment on that. I think that is a message for you to take home more. But let's move back to politics again. We have now a new people who have been elected to the Politburo. What do we know about these individuals? What is the significance of not naming or hinting who will be the successor of the president? Could you comment on that? What do we know about the new Politburo? And what could it lead to?
Well, the fact that we haven't had a named, or actually, I mean, this is one of the informal structures or informal norm that has been going on for the party congress for the last 20 years. That there is a system where you indicate by moving a candidate up to the Politburo, to serve in the Politburo, and then move that person to the standing committee, and that person should be of a certain age in order to be able to be the next general secretary. Well, this did not happen this year because all the members in the standing Politburo, standing committee of the Politburo, are too old to be serving for two terms. They could serve for one term, but not for 2 terms. If they should follow the other informal norm of the pension age, which is the 67 down, 68 up, meaning that when you're 68, you have to retire. And this is nothing that has been written down in any kind of institution or in the charters. It's an informal rule that was made up by Jiang Zemin because he wanted to get rid of Jiang Shangkun during the 90s. But it has become a norm. And that is very important because that's what I was talking about. The system needs predictability in order to get stability. Because the Chinese system, in contrary to, for example, the US system, which has a constitution that actually works and that limits the current president, although he might be extremely unpredictable in what he's doing. The system limits him in what he can do, but you don't have the same thing in China. So in China, you're much more dependent on the leader being predictable. But then you have these informal norms. So that's why it's really important. And that's why it's important that Wang Qishan did not stay on his position in the Politburo, because that would have signaled that this informal norm that you must retire at the age of 69, which he was, that it's broken, and then the predictability of the system disappears. So that's significant. When it comes to the members of the Standing Committee, some people would fear that these new members would only be Xi loyalists. Of course, we don't really know exactly who's loyal to whom. You can speculate. You can see what kind of background they have. If they come from the Communist League, or they come from so-called Prince League. Different kind of discussions of different factions. But it seems that it's quite balanced. For example, Wang Yang, who served in Guangdong, he used to work in the Communist League, so he comes from that kind of background. It's also, when he was serving in Guangdong province as party secretary, he was portrayed as quite a liberal person that did, had a liberal kind of attitude in contrast to other parts. Then, of course, it's really interesting to have an academic, Wang Huning, as a part of the very powerful Standing Committee of the Politburo. We don't know, he's written a lot, has been very tightly connected to all the previous party secretaries. So exactly what that will mean, we don't know, but it's different because it used to be a very technocratic group of people who had engineering backgrounds, but now it's a more mixed of law, social science, so it's interesting in that sense.
Well, time flies, and we'll soon let the audience to ask questions to the panel. I have one final question. I think that will go to you first.
Thank you.
Which, you are now in welcome to Sweden. We are much focused on gender balance. And one thing, in the Congress it seemed that the representation of women have increased from 18 to 25%. But when it comes to Politburo, it has gone down from 2 to 1. Is that an issue that you are discussing much in China? Is that something that is of concern? What is the role of women in Chinese politics, and how could these numbers be interpreted?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I have to reply just very brief. Yes, China is a developing country. We abide by the WTO rules. When we are opening more and more wider to the outside world, we follow the rules. And we also hope that our trading partners will also follow the WTO rules. For example, the sunset clause. Now you should stop using the surrogate, what do you call that? Surrogate country method. Now China should not, the clause. You should honor your commitments also. We are, if you read the report, China will be more and more open. Next is about the gender issue.
Yes.
In China, especially after 1950s, we have a thing that the Chinese women are holding up half of the sky. Usually in families, sometimes the ladies make decisions. They are the queen. This time, maybe there are fewer female members. I think this is a coincidence. When the delegates select the committee members, they only concentrate on their ability, on their experience, on their integrity. Whether you are a gentleman or you are a lady, it's not that important.
Okay, I think we stop there. I think this could lead too far. Of course, the obvious comment from my side would be, isn't it strange that you only found one competent woman for the Politburo in all of China? But I'll leave it to that. Now we have to invite the audience. There is a microphone somewhere. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Loic. I'm French. I live in Sweden since 22 years. And I used to live in different countries, and to work in England, in the States, in Bermuda, and now I'm working here in Sweden. I see Sweden is a very great country, a very good friend to China, but I'm a little bit worried about all the nationalism is coming in Europe, and maybe next year in Sweden it can be a very different politic view that will not be social democrat or moderate. How see China with the nationalism growing in Sweden or in Europe as well? How they will feel about Sweden maybe in 2-3 years if the political atmosphere in Sweden change? Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, diplomat.
I think, Mr. Lee, that goes to you.
Yeah, but I didn't follow him correctly or not. You think that the Chinese nationalism in Europe?
No, the nationalism, growing nationalism in Europe, among those countries where we see that is Sweden, is that a matter of concern on the side of China? That would be the short version.
Yes, non-interference of internal affairs.
Yes, but would lead to some analysis, I suppose. What happens if Europe is moving away from its traditional view on democracy and equal rights, or move into a more protectionistic, nationalistic development?
Well, there are many labels, many camps for different type of people. You call them elites, or you call them populists. You call them nationalists, or you call them patriots. I think the decision, the definition, the right belongs to the local people, not China. But I'm sure that our European friends will make their correct decision. That is good for them, and that's good for the world.
Oskar, please.
But China did have a lot of comments to when Great Britain voted for Brexit, which is linked to this question. So maybe you could relate to that. Like if all the countries, if the European Union would split up into separate nation states because of nationalism, how would that affect China?
Yes. When the Brexit happened, the Chinese government says that we support the European integration. But we don't say, we don't go to Great Britain and say you should stay in Europe. We have our opinion, but we don't oppose our will on others.
Thank you. Ooh. Yeah, we continue on that side. We have the man on row 2 from the back. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentations. My name is Gabriel Johnson and I'm from Korean Studies at Stockholm University. I have 2 questions. One is about the reform of the state-owned enterprises that are considered a burden to the Chinese economy? Are there any signs that the government is doing something to solve this problem, where those companies are a burden and employ more people than is needed from a position of ensuring production? And number two, concerning the power concentration to Xi Jinping, I wonder if someone could comment whether this is a problem from the point of ensuring quality of rule, since we live in a very complex society where it's impossible for one person to know what is needed to know in order to rule a society. So my opinion is that concentration of power to one person in a society is highly undesirable. So could someone comment if this opinion exists in China or not? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My turn.
Your turn, yes. But, I will ask the panel to also complement what you are saying. But make it brief, please.
Thank you. Give me the to speak first. First of all, about the state-owned enterprise. According to our statistics, the SOEs are performing quite good. Are performing, making big profits. Of course, at the same time, we have the reform of the governing system is continuing, and it's more. For example, we welcome private capitals to join the SOE. To mix, just like Sweden's practice, the mixed ownership. This is one way. About the so-called centralization of powers to one person, it's really confusing for me. To be frank, I read the news about the analysis of Chinese politics. Sometimes it's like watching the House of Cards. Cannot be far from the truth. In China, we believe in democratic centralism. What does that mean? That means in a group, every people should have their democratic rights, but there need to be one decision maker. Then after all people have their say, then the chairman or the secretary general or the president will make the final decision. If you follow the discussions in the Chinese network, the internet, if you follow the real developments in the Chinese politics, you can say that we only say Xi Jinping, Comrade Xi Jinping, should be the core of the party, not the king of the party. What does the core mean? Core means decision making to more political consultation and to sometimes make the final decision.
Thank you. Yes, Oskar?
Yeah, can I comment on
yes,
that?
Of course.
Yeah, of course, it's a matter of degree when we talk about concentration of power. It's not about one person deciding everything or anyone else, everybody decides. So it's always a degree. And I think there's been an obvious change in Chinese society during the 5 last years. And the corruption fighting is a part of that. I mean, the whole campaign to fight corruption. Then, of course, it also has a political dimension to fight opponents within the Communist Party. And to answer that question, I think there's advantages of concentration of power and centralization. For example, you'll be able to implement environmental protection policy much stronger, which we might think as be a good thing. And you might be able to implement a lot of policies and fight, what's been called the vested interests in Chinese society. So of course, that could be some of the benefits of concentration of power and centralization of power. But then you also, of course, have the dangers of that. It's always a trade-off. The dangers, if you make a mistake and the power is too concentrated, then the consequence of that would be much worse. And also another point, I think, when it comes to centralization of power is that you lose a lot of the dynamics and initiatives at the local level that you would have. So you can see, for example, now that there's much less innovation when it comes to governance innovations in China than it was previously, because people at the local level are quite uncertain and not as bold in doing this kind of innovations because it's not being encouraged to the same extent. So it's a trade-off between having decentralization and the consequence of that, and the consequences of centralization. And you're somewhere in between those two extreme points.
Kristina?
Could I say something about the state-owned enterprises? I believe that you have to, yes, there are the big centrally owned state-owned enterprises owned by SASAC. Yes, they are, the majority of them are doing fine, but then you also have to remember that there are state-owned enterprises that are owned by local government. And of course you should, I don't know if you should call them state-owned enterprises, but they are in fact owned by local government. And there are problems with those, especially within the steel industry, that there are local authorities who do not want to close down their local steel mills, because they are in fact, I mean, I don't think that the governor or the mayor in Trollhättan would like, if he had a choice, he would probably have kept Saab as the car factory going. But in the end, because we live in a we do not live in a state-planned economy, he had to close down. But so I think, but there are a lot of things going on, and they are closing down. They do have programs where they will take care of millions of unemployed state-owned state-owned enterprise workers that will be eventually laid off. But it is very tough. It's a very tough thing to do, especially these like locally owned enterprises.
Thank you. Let's move over to this side. Third row, yes. And please introduce yourself. And we have 15 minutes to go. We have to close it for 4 o'clock sharp. So, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panel for a most interesting discussion. My name is Major General Mats Engman, so I'd like to return to one of the military issues that was brought up by Dr. Saalman. You mentioned 3 strands that you picked out from the party congress when it concerns the military development in China. If I remember correctly, you talked about technology, projection, and the third was?
Organization, yeah.
Organization, thank you. If you combine that with some of the other strands that we have seen lately, my conclusion out of that is you have seen a dramatic change of the Chinese military from an inward-looking military to a military with a very clear ambition and currently capability for power projection outside China. Do you foresee that China will use this power projection capability for a more assertive risk management and military deployment outside China in support of the rest of the world? Or is it more based on nationalistic interest? Thank you.
So Lora, short answer please.
Sure. I mean, it's an excellent question. I think certainly in bringing up projection, I do see obviously China playing a more active or having a greater footprint abroad, certainly in terms of its military force projection. That's a natural extenuation of what's already been happening at the regional level. And you probably saw this most with with actually the installation of the oil rig off of the coast of Vietnam, where it used to be essentially Coast Guard deployments more at the lower level, but then we're finally in most recent times when things were most tense backed up by the Navy. Now I think when you look at what's happening certainly in terms of Gwadar, Sri Lankan port access, Maldives, all these other areas in which China has been building up this port access, of course there's the economic rationale, But military does go hand in hand with that, right? It is for shoring up these, not just sea lines of communication, but in also ensuring, for example, piracy off of the Gulf of Aden. That's part of the reason you see this military base in Djibouti. And bringing back this point to Africa as well, we've seen cases where you've seen unrest, instability, and the necessity of being able to airlift out essentially Chinese civilians, personnel, and others. So I think that this is really just going to become a natural extenuation of China's larger economic interests abroad, certainly through the Belt and Road Initiative. It's natural, and finally on this last point, since I'm being brief, it's not just the official military as well, there are also security organizations that are being deployed in Pakistan and elsewhere. I believe one of them is called IWA. There are a number of these that have been based abroad. So we're going to see this at a number of different levels. And it's not that similar to what you've seen in the US and in a number of countries engage in. So I wouldn't be alarmist about it. I think it's part and parcel.
Thank you very much. The gentleman with the head with the scarf.
Uno Svedin, Stockholm University Resilience Center. The question on climate change has come up as a touchdown in the ambassador's presentation. Thank you for that one. But it could be expanded not only to be seen as a partial environmental issue, it could also be seen in the light of the increasing Chinese ambition to play a global role. So it's sort of both a partial but also a grander type of issue. And the question is then, especially in a global situation where the US is withdrawing from the Paris Accords, how China see that, you could say, foresight visionary type of position, and in taking a broader role, which is important for us all. And it could also be seen in a sort of timing sequence, sort of short term, medium term, longer term. And how is the Chinese position on that after the Party Congress?
China is committed to the Paris Accord. We will do our job and fulfill our responsibility. I think the international community, the majority of them, the international community, will fully understand the situation now. It's quite urgent, and we should do something now. As for other countries' policy, as I said, it's their choice.
Thank you very much. Oh, good. We have maybe time for 2 or 3 questions, depending on how long they are. Okay. Yeah, I'd be pleased to give it to lady. Yeah, you down there, yes. Good. You're so receptive.
Hi, I'm a student from China. Just now we always talk about how China faced the challenge, how China faced the problem for North Korea. But what I'm curious, how Western country faced to the Chinese the development. Do you feel the threat or the pressure from China, our development? And where it's come from, it's from military strengths, or it's from economy, or it's from where, and how you face and how you solve this kind of pressure.
Thank you very much. I think this is for the Swedish part of the panel. Oskar, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. I think in general that, if I should speak for all the Swedes then, see Chinese development and expansion in terms of economic terms as a very good thing, as a very positive thing. I think the worry is the fact that, if you deal with governments in an international democratic order and all the governments are democratic, then you speak the same kind of language. So I think the worry is that a rising China shouldn't at the same time be too authoritarian. I think that is the fear. And I think that is, I think this is a misunderstanding between, the Chinese and the West many times, that what people are worried about isn't China as a country, or the rise of China. It is a Chinese that is being governed with the two authoritarian system. So, and what comes with that. Because if you want to maintain an international order, you want to follow the same kind of norms, the same kind of principles. So it's a double kind of answer to that question. Of course, then, and I should add then that it doesn't mean that everyone expects China to be democratic, but there's many steps between a very non-democratic and a democratic country. So a more open China and a more more open and free China, I think definitely the West and Sweden would welcome that in this expansion. But on the other hand, if you see this going together with a more and more strongly controlled and less politically free China, then I think there's going to be more fear following that.
Okay. Yes, the other lady.
Hey, I'm Ellie, I'm an Australian student, and I was involved in the Confucius program, which is a Chinese initiative to help further educate Western people within the Chinese culture. We were funded to learn the Chinese language and also travel on exchange to China. But this exchange wasn't actually an exchange because no students from China then came back to Australia. And my question is, do you think that the Chinese government is too defensive of its own values to allow students to then integrate within Western culture? Do you see this changing in the future, or do you think that way of the program running will stay the same?
My question.
Definitely your question.
Yes, it's a little confusing. According to my impression, more and more Chinese students are going abroad, are studying abroad. Sometimes even the middle school students are becoming to studying abroad. And for example, the exchange students to Sweden for the past 2 or 3 years almost doubled. Of course, the Confucius Institute is an interesting one. Many Swedish friends want to learn Chinese, want to understand China, and then with bilateral agreement, there is an institute in the Stockholm University. But we don't know why it's closed. And after its closure, a lot of Swedish friends, including some parents of the students, complained to us, why do you close that one? It's not our decision.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Hi, Jonathan Sols, I'm a student here in Stockholm. My question is mainly directed towards the Swedish panelists, and it is, does the nationwide rollout to the Sesame credit system worry you, and if so, how much? And where do you see the future of China going as a consequence of this development? Thank you.
Would you like to answer? Oskar,
please go. Okay. Well, we don't really know that much about the social credit system yet because it's still being developed. But the signals that we hear about this, I'm quite worried about it. And I think giving the state so much power to control citizens and to register citizens is a problem in any country around the world, especially if you don't have a system where you can guarantee the rights of the citizens. So I think this is something that, that I don't know how we would actually, how we can expect it to be dealt with in a very positive way. Maybe we should introduce what we're talking about. The social credit system is like a system that kind of gives you a score, right, for how you perform in a different way. It could be, which is also in Western countries, you have a kind of a credit system, so you can have a score when you want to buy something. But this apparently seems to be more developed in China's case, that it also includes other aspects. As I was saying, we don't know how far it's going to develop. But if it's going to include, for example, to what extent you are loyal, to what extent you follow the law, to what extent you, all these different kind of dimensions, then it becomes a system that really controls the individual to a very far extent. I mean, then we're going back to the old days of China, where people were controlled at the individual level. So I'm really skeptical.
And they even had similar system, I mean, very similar system during the Cultural Revolution, where you would get a dark spot in your dangan, in your file, and then you would be able to enter universities and so on.
I don't think we have time for any more questions. Regrettably, I know there were many hands raised in the air, but we have to move on because we need to close. Mr. Lee had asked just to comment on a few things, very shortly.
Very short. First of all, thanks ISDP for hosting this event. It's really helpful. We should have more. I want to only make 3 suggestions, quite simple. First one, when we talk about China, please ask yourself, what do you really want? Do you want the Chinese people to have a better life, living in a standard? If so, you should thank the CPC because what's her achievements. Secondly, when you hear some people talk about China, please look them into the eyes and ask yourself, what do they want? Do they want Chinese people to have a better life, or do they want to settle their personal scores, or to realize their political or economic interests? Thirdly, when you meet Chinese people, when you meet me, please ask yourself, are the Chinese people the same as you? They also have feelings, they also want equal treatment, they also want to be treated with dignity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, time flies when we are having fun, and I think your closing words were really gave us all food for thought, and also realizing there are a number of items we haven't been able to touch upon. I got a whole list of possible questions and counter questions, and we could probably fill another 2 hours easily. I want to thank you all for coming, but I would particularly want to thank the ambassador for starting it off with an interesting and well-covered keynote speech. We highly appreciated that, and the excellent panel. What a panel we have! So much expertise and sharing it so. Thank you very much.